great-grandfather, Gamble, William Gamble, was the one who did the vision on Dred Scott.
Yeah, you're kidding.
That said he was a free man.
Yeah. Interesting.
If I can get everyone's attention real quick. Continue, keep eating, great dinner tonight, great dessert. What I'd like to do now,
and on time.
If I can get everyone's attention. All right, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. We have our speaker tonight is Chruch. He's going to talk about a few of his books and some different historical facts. If you haven't met Chris before, he's got some great stories. We look forward to having Chris talk to us tonight. And we'll hopefully have some time for some questions for him as well.
Thanks. Okay. Hello, all. Not working?
Yeah. It's working pretty good. I was holding it too close.
Yep.
So. If you need any water or anything, let me know.
Everybody hear me all right? Hello. Hello. Well, guys, while you guys enjoy your steak and stories, I thought while you're enjoying your steak, I should give you some stories. Preferably not about life insurance. I thought it might be kind of a fun night. But before we do, I'd like to ask James and David to come out and thank them for their service for us tonight. Please. James, would you ask David to come out? Thank you so much for your... He's left. He spiked the food, and he's gone. Thanks, James. Well, listen, guys, I know many of you. Some of you I don't know very well. I hope my long-winded night doesn't interfere with your evening. So please get up and fill your glass of wine or go powder your nose. And if you don't come back, I will fully understand. So don't worry about that. Ross Perot, you'll excuse me for reading a little bit. Ross Perot, his VP running mate, Admiral Stockdale, who many of you might remember, surprised all of us when he said, "Who am I and why am I here?" Well, let me try to answer that about myself here tonight. One of my fondest writers, and as a sweet, gentle man as well, is David McCullough, whose manner in approaching both the subject matter and as a writer of it is filled with the wonder of a child. Like him, I get an itch somehow from certain slices of history. I think most people feel this now and again. However, few take it as a signal to research it. Few are still to write of it. And that has been my struggle here for the body of work from which my eyes first peered into history. Why is there organ music playing in the background? I feel like I'm at my own funeral. Clearly there's a microphone open in the church on this same frequency. Would you close that? The door's closed.
Yeah, we check with Jay.
Yeah. Turn the microphone off in the church. Well, anyway. I think that most people now and again look at history as rather dry stuff. A few take it as a signal to research it as I have, and I found that it was my natural curiosity. I sort of scratched the paint away from the surface of the glass, and I was able to peek through, and I was quite surprised. And more importantly, history, as dull as it may be, Jan and I had a nice chat over dinner about the interesting aspect of history, but it's particularly nice when we find humanity there. And the amazing chance is when God is there. And so I'm so glad tonight to be able to come to you to talk about God in history, because it has played such a key role in how we've all developed here today with our own families who have come from many countries around the world and ultimately to you, to St. Michael and St. George. The body of work from inside my own family history and how it is a factor in the French story in America and other stories of pursuing human freedoms became that dog whistle to which I responded. For it is in the reality of the humanity where I found such providence to exist. This, the God in things, is the nuclear core which powered their hearts. In our family's history, on my father's side, quite interesting, on our French side through my father, John Audubon is a partner of my ancestor. On my mother's side, we have 4 from the Mayflower and the Winthrop fleet, and an ancestry which includes being descendant of 10 saints. Now, my wife will dispute this fact, but from the Desloge family letters, which we have a great deal to thank our ancestors for in keeping the written word and not destroying them, we have over 600 individual letters written by my family that have remained extant and interesting. And that's what launched my research from these very interesting facts. I know you'll forgive me for reading this, but I'd like to give you an outline and share with you some excerpts from 2 of my books which tie providence of God as played out in history, while also seeking into the future, or questioning about the future, how God shall form man's framework. I have prepared this talk tonight so that I could make these excerpts from my writings entertaining for you, but also by these perspectives, you may also be informed by the mystery of God. At least that's my hope. But perhaps increasing your wine intake may also be useful, though, so fill up your bottles of wine, your glasses of wine. So let's open this little play in the mid-1600s in the Gulf of Mexico. The lightning strike from the tremendous storm exploded in a white-hot flash to almost blind him, but with just enough afterlight to permit the scene to be unveiled in all of its horror. With the black waves now as high as a house and an ocean spray whipping into stinging shards, William could see only the smashed debris, sails, and timber of what used to be his ship. Casks and cargo that could float were scattered across the waves, as well were smashed the floating bodies of the passengers and crew. The piercing volume of the wind was so terrific that it made listening more painful than fruitful. Desperately, William sought out his father among the flotsam, straining to see any person, anyone at all. It was more than his mind could handle, he thought. His father had only several hours ago tucked him in for the night in their warm cabin, alit with candle glow. Orville had sat on the edge of the ship's berth next to his boy and kissed his head to assure him that the approaching storm would pass and that the sea would permit the sea her rightful journey. Reassured, young William nestled in as the ship shook and jolted through the building sea. He had not seen his father since. Lightning once more brought the figures out of the darkness. The collapsed masts, the ship now in pieces, and no boat or man or animal to be seen in the darkness again closed the shutter on the carnage. William had no time to think about the salt water forcing its way down his throat. Moving his hands from his life-saving flail in the water to his throat and mouth as he coughed and vomited the sea. Several times his grip on the sea failed him as large waves took him under to the dreadful darkness and quiet he instantly knew as death's easy face. Either the buoyancy of an 8-year-old, fate, luck, or skill returned him to the blinding and deafening tempest above. His clean white night clothes, only hours before, were now torn and bloodied. His pants gone to the depths, and despite the warm latitude, the water was painfully cold. He called for his father as loud as his 8-year-old voice could muster in an attempt to outdo the wail of the wind and the crash of the sea. His yelling into the ink darkness was sent in all directions as his body had been tumbled over. He knew not where the ship was or where his father may be. Another lightning blast, and he was reoriented. Only this time it is nothing. Only bodies and pieces of wood. The little boy, full of delight and eagerness only hours ago, was now dead, for sure. On the occasion when a wave would overcome him and he was faced again with the watery grave of silence, he considered not fighting but sinking just deep enough that there would be no hope of gasping air again. But with the thought of his father, if alive, he could not quit. And if dead, he had to live for his father. Up until this point of this young life, where school and friends, simple times, and joy occupied his mind, the seriousness and frightfulness of his new circumstances emboldened him. Adulthood had jumped upon his back like an 800-pound gorilla. The gale of the Gulf of Mexico had taken all souls to the depths, including his beloved father, Orville. As daybreak neared, the storm moved east, leaving behind just a few items that had not sunk or sailed off. William, half naked, nearly drowned, and entirely exhausted, swam the great distance to meet up with a hogshead cask, which had luckily been emptied by its handler and had replaced its wooden top. Around this he reached his arms, and for the first time in many horrifying hours he had safety. If not from exposure, then from immediate drowning. Providence again allowed this sweet, desperate 8-year-old boy to cling to safety. The weather cleared and the sea stilled. The sun faded and rose for several days. Yet this boy held fast. With waning strength to remain gripping the barrel, the boy drifted. He was the only speck in the vast sea. No item, no body, no father, but he lived. Now, let us leave William here in the 1600s and fast forward 150 years. But now to the North Atlantic, which was furious that September day in 1822, which by all accounts of the experienced sailors of that era, late September was far too advanced for such a long crossing to America. The odds heavily favored the great sea rather than the ship that rode upon it. Aboard were crew and passengers, among whom was young Frenchman, age 19, Firmin René Desloge. This was his first experience at sea, and it was expected to be calm as they departed. They had sailed from Nantes, France, on the Loire River to Bordeaux without mishap. But their next leg from Bordeaux was disaster. The Bay of Biscay is an ocean itself, cupped between the northern coast of Spain and the western coast of France. While this traverse of the French coast was fairly routine, any premonition of dangerous weather would prescribe the crew to tack to a safe harbor, logically. However, the darkness, speed, and severity of the advancing squall attacked the ship like Vesuvius on Pompeii. And without warning, the ship was battered into pieces and cargo flailed off her decks. The sails, having been short-sheeted, were shredded into bits anyway. The masts, with only their rope rigging exposed to the elements, were still no match for the storm blast as they all three gave way in pieces and crashed to the ship's deck in the ocean. Firmin, having no reference for such an attack, had no senses for action other than how his life might be saved. Men on decks working desperately were taken away by the wind and waves, which crashed over bow and gunwales. The scuppers must have been overwhelmed as water entered her holds and cabin areas. Seams of the ship's wooden planked hull were split open as she foundered, although somehow she was kept afloat. by fate or by angels. By all accounts, this was shaping up to be a maximum maritime fatality. Furman had the clear memory of how fate had brought him here. In 1822, Furman Desloge's father faced the pressures and tragedy of the aftermath of the French Revolution. Napoleon had been exiled to Alba and then craftily returned to France. Armies had been mustered to fight the English, the Russians, and the Spanish. Waterloo had shaken the nation in Europe. The Bourbon Restoration had taken place. Napoleon had been exiled to St. Helena. Furman's brother and brother-in-law already were conscripted and were fighting. In some cases, torture remained permissible. The life of Victor Hugo's Jean Valjean, fleeing vicious police officer Javert in Les Miserables, was very much the real scene. In October 1822, France intervened to restore the Spanish monarchy. On January 22, 1823, a secret treaty was signed at the Congress of Verona, allowing France to invade Spain to restore Ferdinand VII as an absolute monarch. On January 28, 1823, Louis VIII announced that 100,000 Frenchmen were ready to march, invoking the name of St. Louis to safeguard the throne of Spain for a grandson of Henry IV of France. Furman's brother-in-law was in the Army of Observation in Spain at the time, and Furman, too, would soon be expected to draw his number for the draft. Diminutions of liberties and the resulting depression created great personal strife. Despite their relative social position, the family was faced with a desperate France where opportunity was scarce and an impending military draft to mount troops to invade Spain or England. I've not finished my sentence there well. I should edit that at some point. Arrangements had been underway for several years by Furman's mother, and Furman remembered that this trip was a possibility even when he was age 12, when his older brother was the prospect to go to America. But prospects change, and Furman was at the age when the opportunity developed. At age 19 years old, he departed a torn and struggling France for frontier America, never to see his family again. We get a glimpse of the secrecy of his departure from his father. I quote, "Son, I wish to make a last effort in your interests, not wishing to attract the power of the government to you in any manner." Arrangements had been made to join Furman's uncle in the once French territory west of the Mississippi River. His uncle had formed a friendship and partnership with John James Audubon some 20 years earlier, and together they had left France to avoid further conscription into the French military. They had attempted mining and mercantile business at several places in America for a number of years. Audubon had relocated to pursue his now famous legacy, and Furman's uncle remained in the new Louisiana Purchase territory, now Missouri. In the urgency of Furman's departure, his beloved best friend and father planned to rendezvous with him at the meeting place of St. Pierre on the morning of August 25th, the day of Furman's departure from France. In the confusion of the sailing time or the tribulations of his father's journey to the seaport, Furman waited many hours for his father, but he did not come. At 19, alone, empty and distraught, he boarded the ship in despair, never to see, embrace, or kiss his father again until they met again in heaven. He had been aboard the ship only a few days, all the while filled with deep sorrow over his departure and missing his father. Now aboard the storm-ravaged ship somewhere off the coast of France or Spain, Furman thought that he would be the first one there to await his father in heaven. The storm was relentless and deadly, and Furman held fast to what he could on board the ship as it was smashed and battered. Without sails, the crew was powerless to hold any course. Between flying chinaware and furniture, seasickness and cramped quarters, gripping the ship to prevent being thrown around and injured. Furman now knew horror. The crew did what they could to handle their ship, praying to avoid the assured death of the dreaded broaching, where she rounds up in the wind and exposes her beam to the wild seas and wind. In a high sea, this dangerous situation can put a ship over on her side or worse, capsize her. The weight of a fully laden capsized ship would have put her on the bottom of the bay in minutes, with not even a moment available for her passengers or crew to act. They would all go down with her, and fast. At least there was comfort that it would be fast. These horrifying realities were in play that dreadful night, as she had little, if any, control to force her to take on the waves. For all practical purposes, she was a cork, a sinking cork. The ship and all her souls on board were at the mercy of the fates, or luck, or divine providence. Furman held fast also to his belief in God. At 19 years old, this was likely his first opportunity to explode from his very soul the request of the grace of God upon himself. The storm must have been quite large because Furman's brother, just 3 years older, at age 22, was aboard a ship heading to Nantes, 100 or so miles north. Timothy, who had been aboard ships for several years at that point, was an experienced seaman. Nevertheless, the storm violently damaged the ship, also killing 3 men aboard. Furman Desloge's and Timothy's storm is likely the second of 4 major hurricanes that year in the Atlantic. This hurricane moved northwest from the Bahamas on September 25th to hit Charleston on September 27th. It claimed the lives of hundreds of slaves who found themselves trapped in the low-lying Santee Delta, miles from higher ground and with no shelter. It caused 300 or more deaths, but managed to break a drought in the Richmond area, then headed northeast into the Atlantic and arched east, aimed directly at France. These storms typically peter out once in the open ocean, but this storm would have none of that. 2 lads in the high seas having no clue of the unforeseen storm. Timothy Desloge on the Hypaman from Martinique, heading to Nantes, and Furman Desloge leaving from Bordeaux on the ship Mississippi. Furman's dashed ship limps into Bilbao, Spain, and Timothy, having lost men at sea, is blown into land at Lorient, France, where injuries were so substantial that he was quarantined, recovering from his injuries and illnesses for 2 months in that city. 2 brothers of nearly the same age on the ocean at the same time in the same storm, 100 miles apart, neither realizing the other was in peril. But occasionally the Lord listens and responds. As the winds blew through the sea, it settled. The crew of Furman's ship was able to get a handle on her, finally. Stricken and wounded, she found that when the weather cleared and some control gained, the nearest place to harbor was the northern shore of Spain at the town of Bilbao, 200 miles south of Nantes and 100 miles south of Bordeaux. The Mississippi and her stricken remaining crew and passengers crept into harbor for salvation. Well, I've just introduced to you William and Furman. These characters, William and Furman, or rather William first, or Furman first, and then William, who is the grandfather of Furman's new wife, Cynthia, arrive on the stage precisely out of the infinitesimal chance in having beaten mind-numbing odds. The fact that neither should even be here in the first place, given the near-death experiences extant in their lives and history. The overarching question is, and is for this saga, was it luck or was it providence? A greater question for those who are descendant of these people is, how is it possible that they are here? So a major point. Providence has played a serious role in both of these men's goals to a better life. Their desire for self-improvement, their flight from bondage by conscription in the French, even their religious freedom, but as well their opportunity. So I'm going to switch gears here from that interesting past and drive us into the middle of the 1800s, sort of shift an ethos with you a little bit, and sort of do a quick point-counterpoint and compare ourselves in the 1600s era of Salem to the 21st century, an ethos which has shifted more to the improved condition of man, where in the 1600s we were dipping witches into the lake. But the brain grew over time. An improved thinker occurred. Think of this. The deletion of slavery occurred in this very short period of time. Abraham Lincoln was nailed on both sides of this issue by both pro-slavery and anti-slavery, by both of them saying the Lord was on our side. And Abraham Lincoln had to sit there and accept both arguments together. He was wise enough to say, and I quote, "Well, gentlemen, it is not often that one is favored with the delegation direct from the Almighty." And later, vexed, he adroitly ruminated that, well, we all know that the Lord was always on the side of the right. It was his constant anxiety to find the nation to come down on the side of the Lord. Well, we've come quite a distance from the 1600s to the 1800s to the 21st century in eras of civil rights and human rights. But God remains a very strong player here. Inside of the quiet heart of man, in silence, there is love. Agape lives here. Peace lives here. God tells us, God guides us, God goads us by nibbling at our souls. I want for you what you want for you. Quite the opposite from the picture of Salem in the 1600s. So I also want to reflect on the theories of healing and reconciliation that occurred in our family history and how God can play an essential role in these and in which we can see in history itself by sharing with you a couple of additional comments between the descendant of a slave owner, moi, and the descendant of a slave who I befriended. So I know that these are lightning rod issues, especially in this city, but nonetheless, let me give you a quick story. I'm going to start quoting you from my book here. The house, typically filled with activity from a large family, was strikingly quiet for a December day just before Christmas. Only muted footsteps to and fro from the window drapes. At 3:15 in the afternoon on December 14th, 1863, in this small rural town, a year and a half before the end of the Civil War, she entered the home from the street, and being met by 3 of the 11 household slaves, she held the hand of one of them and in a soft voice delivered words impossible then to the human ear, at least in this state. She said, "Dinah and all of you are free and slaves no more." Thus came to an end the ownership of slaves in my family. 7 years before, in an inventory, 7 of these were listed as, and I'm going to pause here to get your attention. 3 horses, $100. 3 cows, $25. 2 watches and 2 clocks, $75. 2 carriages, $300. Furniture, $500. Slaves, 1 man, 3 women, 2 girls, $1,500, and 1 boy, $500. Somewhere in the fall of 1987, at age 29, I picked up a large box from behind a group of pillows on the top shelf in a closet outside my parents' bedroom in the St. Louis Country Club grounds, if that isn't a counterpoint for you, wherein I located 6 volumes of typed letters. I needed only open the first page to reveal it as the large volume of family genealogies coupled with the narratives from over 600 letters written from my family's ancestors. I was mesmerized with the stories buried deep in the genealogies, but the individual letters themselves spoke an intimate family vernacular of care, courtesy, missed love, devotion, and business matters. The family letters reflected an industrialist, naturalist, and philanthropic family. They confirmed a great American immigrant story and of small business, international trade, and international relationships on the bounding sea, with Conestoga wagons rumbling rutted roads, all before the 19th century. But then, as I sat in my living room at 1 o'clock in the morning with my family asleep, my son here being one of them, I ran headlong into being present at history again. And this time, I was stunned to the core. The page I was at that moment at 1 a.m. reading was the following. Bill of sale for Negro girl, Mary, Stephen Dunklin to Furman Desloge. And stunned was not the word, crushed was one, embarrassed another, ashamed another, all in a rush in my mind. And then my eyes settled on the most distressing of all words. Mary, aged about 12 years, a slave for life. And I ruffled every onion skin page for the next several hours, seeking more information and found more distressing news. And I knew then why, likely, that these books had been kept hidden where they were. The reality of slavery was all over these letters of that era. And in fact, I ruminated destroying them with some cheap attempt to exorcise them from my memory. I truly felt as if all my families enjoyed social courtesies and respect was balanced and worth more than some old letters. So for the last 22 years, these letters just occupied that box, and I always since then had an ache I could not describe. I couldn't even discuss it, much less manage it. And there the memory remained, all things in those letters dormant, stained together because of those pages. But it was around 2004 when I opened those pages again, having had a generation of time to temper my feelings. But I remember I read around slave narratives like skiing past a tree. I started to spend some quality time on the genealogy aspects, which reflected much of the amazing stories I have shared with you just above. And it dawned on me that being present at history had 2 sides of the knife. It cut both ways, good and bad. And thus started some healing in me about the slavery issue in our family. But I wanted to understand better the psychological impacts of other families who have had similar surprises or who have known this all along and decided to ignore it. At the Missouri Historical Society, I stumbled over a couple of books, and one in particular called Slaves in the Family by Edward Ball, in which I read of the reconciliation of descendants of former slaves and descendants of former slave owners, and I felt somewhat relieved of this ability to find peace. I read slave narratives. I read vitriolic demands for reparations. I read wailing cries of apology and forgiveness. And in some way, I thought that what was in our letters was not so much family skeleton, as had been well discussed by others already, as it was that I was just slow to catch up with the dialogue. Yet I still remained haunted by our family having owned slaves. I had no such personal involvement or ability to seek out any descendant of a slave or of my great-great-grandfather, and I wasn't sure I really wanted to. But I read a book written by Teresa Del Sone and her sister, Mildred Johnson, called These Freedom, in which they provide strong, creative nonfiction narrative to tell the story of their slave ancestor, Melindy. And more than a narrative, I found their healing and reconciliatory tone very peaceful. They use words like forgiveness. Mildred Johnson writes in her acknowledgments of her book, and I quote, "I acknowledge my family to continue to use their freedom to make a profound difference through service to others and to live life with the passion and purpose our ancestors had in extremely difficult times," unquote. And in her preface of the book, Mrs. Johnson writes, "We encourage all folk to honor and remember our ancestors, our teachers." She continues by saying, "Let us bring our ancestors to life in our thoughts and listen to their stories with understanding and love. Most of all, let there be malice toward none and freedom always for all." I was stunned. But one word I found in our letters, more accurately in the last will and testament, continued to really bother me. The last will and testament of my great-great-grandfather, Furman Desloge. And I really do. If I do sound a bit daft, I mean to say that this word kept calling to me because it just spoke volumes and I couldn't make peace with it. I literally feared that the word would bother me until my death, lest I attempted to understand it. The word was and is, etc. ETC, ET period, C period. It is this, 150 years ago, referring to slaves, not with human dignity, but shockingly referred to in many situations after cattle, among a category sometimes shown to say, quote, "For love and affection I have for my children, I give feather beds, furniture, cows, kitchen utensils, implements, slaves, etc." Etc. One cannot not be moved when considering that other human beings, children even, were considered as etc. That rotten little Latin expression that means and other things, and so forth. So Furman Desloge, my great-great-grandfather, third great-grandfather, writes to his mother in France in 1815. He's new to France. He's new to America from France. The French have already given up the practice of slavery. England already has given up the practice of slavery. France has not. And he writes, "It still seems, my dear Mama, that your good city of Nantes still continues the traffic of Negroes. She may flatter herself that she holds the first place in this kind of trade, but not a day goes by in our papers that gives us detailed accounts of how it operates this way and shows it in an ugly light. This idea shocks me all the more heretofore. I glorified in having Nantes as my adopted city, yet I firmly hope that one day the government will take rigid measures to suppress totally such an abominable trade." 1815. Yet, with his abhorrence of slavery, in 1815, Furman Desloge dies in 1856 with 11 slaves mentioned in his will. I'd like to kill the son of a bitch. I was that mad at him. I mention their names here for you as a gift. Bill, Mary, Ben, Diana, Charity, Emily, Adeline, Thomas, Jane, Maria, Susan. Not mentioned in the will are the names of other slaves no longer on the scene: Ida, Louisiana. And in the memory of all the enslaved in my family, I personally acknowledge that all those mentioned in these pages, that I have complete love and affection for each one of them. And know that one day we will meet in heaven, and I will be able to embrace them with this love in person. And so I sought out Teresa Del Son and her "Let There Be Malice Toward None" invitation to help me with my ache. And I started this conversation with the following letter to her. Teresa and I wrote back and forth to one another over half a year, never meeting each other except in emails. These letters are deep and with the kind of love and reconciliation found between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. In fact, our conversation is so important that I wrote, quote, "This conversation between you and I is less you and I and more time and space, culture and culture, history and history, race and race, mankind and mankind." And I continued to say to her, "Is it possible that the future of our society can be a better place because our races have had this conversation and our races have identified a loving center?" It was at Teresa's questioning whether I could find any benevolence in the letters of ours, over 600 of them, and reading more thoroughly, I find a couple of comments. The U.S. Congress prohibited slavery in the territories of 1862 in June, reversing the Dred Scott decision. And as powerful as the Emancipation Proclamation may have been on January 1st of 1863, it did not apply to the Union slave states of Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky, or Tennessee. Slavery in Missouri officially ended 2 years later on January 1st, 1865, by executive order of our Governor Fletcher. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which was passed by the Senate on April 8th of 1864, passed by the House in January of 1865, was adopted on December 6th of 1865. However, the magnanimous Desloge family had made application to free their slaves on December 12th, 1863, 2 years before. I would not have known this had it not been for Teresa, the descendant of a slave, urging me to dig deeper into our own family's history. And now, back to God, so I've not bored you to tears. The doctor, and back to God, the doctor or psychiatry who penned the, there was a fellow who wrote the foreword of our book. He was, in fact, a doctor of psychiatry who penned the foreword of our book and said, "It was fascinating to see there, Chris and Teresa's conversation turn spiritual and focus on purpose. They follow suit as they speak in their emotional distress. Byproducts of racism and slavery, a white man's shame and guilt, and a black woman's anger and shame. The question is, did they survive, overcome, and define themselves? Definitely, yes." That's pretty cool. So God was very, very much present among every paragraph between we two, as well as how we say God is present with her slave ancestor, Melindy, and even my slave ancestor, Furman Desloge. To put a finer point on this, Teresa says to me, "I think the inner voice, the God within who advised me to allow Chris into my sandbox without prejudice, without fear, and inherent suspicion of a white man. And how my words to her again, echoed this when I said to her, an acknowledgement for this work would be void if it did not honor the spirit of Teresa Delson, her sister Mildred Johnson, and her whole ancestor family. These special people and their hearts accepted my overture to open a dialogue not just between persons of races or even cultures, but between spirits. Transcending modern segregation of thought, transcending safety of silence. I can hear my father right now in silence. We built that chance together, built that bridge, the handshake that God had always desired. In essence, these words that we had written were not ours at all, not mine, not Teresa's, but his. These are God's words that were written. So God has played the guiding principle in our ancestors' experiences, coming here, and in our healing and reconciliation of their experiences and our own experiences now. As a historian, it is not difficult for me to project forward into history and stand there and look back here. But here my mind has begun to wonder whether ancestry itself might be at risk with the recent news as follows. I quote, "This is from the news 7 days ago, people. Children are now being created from the cells derived from many parents. 4, 5, 6, 20 different parents." My mind went forward 1,000 years, as if my ancestor, William the Conqueror, were looking at me from the shore of France before invading England. What will ancestry mean then in the year 3014 if science has contributed 50% of the planet built of 15 parents in search of the perfect cell structure? Well, this does not bode well for the business of ancestry, certainly, 1,000 years hence. One factor I am confident will remain will be the person's relationship with God. In this I have hope, or rather faith. The rule of St. Benedict may well stand and be worthy and valuable to the human spirit, when even the human itself cannot determine its own history before the mixing of 15 unknown persons' cells in a test tube. We knew this day was coming when the first test tube baby occurred and Dolly the sheep showed up on the scene. But I am not here to agree or disagree with those points. The central point is that God will be here among people. Even those who have no capacity for ancestry, just as he was there when God was central to the burgeoning families who could trace their lineage back to the time of Christ. And there were humans, and there, when humans were groveling on riverbanks asking, why? Well, as I wrote here, I said, let me sum up for you. And then I wrote, as I hear a collective exhale of thank God he's almost done. Let me conclude with one piece. A letter written sometime after Teresa and I concluded our writing together. I wrote to her the following note. I think it's a nice way to end tonight, too. Dear Teresa, I had the great fortune on Sunday to fly from New Orleans to St. Louis with the Mississippi River right outside of my aircraft window the entire way. From 42,000 feet, I watched as the twists and turns unfolded. I thought of my great-great-grandfather who came to New Orleans in 1823 and then slowly ascended up the Mississippi River. I watched the confluence of the Ohio come into view. And for many minutes, I was able to feel what he felt turning left up the Mississippi past the Ohio, and how his uncle in 1806 felt descending the Ohio with Audubon that cold winter and hanging a right up the Mississippi River. I also was able to see something else of note. From 42,000 feet, I see the fields and woods on one side of the Mississippi, and to see the fields and woods on the other side of the Mississippi, to see little difference between Missouri and Illinois, physically, but to look down as if I was flying over this exact spot in 1852 and see the same, no physical difference between the two places, but to see and feel the difference between slavery on one soil and freedom on the other soil. To see this from heaven's perspective made me choke up. At 42,000 feet, I was in tears. A simple ribbon of water separating two minds, two lives, two humankinds. Well, Teresa, it was truly a godly experience to wonder how these two could be so close and yet so distant. People would do well now and again to spend more time considering things from that altitude. Perhaps it is because God is local when you're at 42,000 feet. Blessings to you, my dear. Hernando de Soto, the Spanish conquistador and explorer, named the Mississippi River Rio de Espiritu Santo, River of the Holy Spirit, after finding it. In continuing to ingest our conversation, and as it comes to improve me, I am taken that the same Rio de Espiritu Santo runs through me. Thank you, Teresa, for the conversation and journey of a lifetime, your friend forever, Chris. So I finish tonight by saying to you, I thank you here tonight for having me at Steak and Stories. I hope you've enjoyed these stories with your steak, although I almost had a heart attack on my piece. And I hope you enjoyed seeing how God plays a significant role in history and for the improved state of man. But there's work ahead for sure, until one day some guest 100 years future at Steak and Stories will stand here at this podium and write how we here tonight started that voyage. Thank you very much. So I know it's late. If you guys have any questions, I'm glad to answer them for you. Yes, sire.
I think any one of us who were to find that box of 600 letters would have, yes, probably been shocked, but very likely we could have probably gone on with our lives. What was it about that, and what was it about you that you found such a personal violation that caused you to go on this crusade?
Well, did everybody hear the question about how is it that I took it to my heart, an arrow to the heart? I think it's a great question because, I'm a family of 6, and there are 20 years that separate. Is this vodka? In the name of God, thank you. I wouldn't. Do I need this? Are you pushing me off the podium?
Oh, no, it's for your enjoyment.
Oh, thank you. It is vodka. Thank you very much. It's a great question because in my family there are 6 kids, 20 years apart. In fact, it's weird for me because I've got people here who are my brother and sister's friends in ages. Okay, Bob Street is my brother's age. And Bob, how are you? 72 or 73 or something like that? 75. Okay, and Bob is my sister Lolly's acquaintance, a peer. Okay, so I come from a family of 6 that had 20 years between us. In my own family, my brother Steve is a good example of the fellow who would never have allowed this stuff into his heart. He takes an attitude of it is what it is. And yet, somewhere along the lines, and I couldn't understand where it was, but I'll tell you what happened. At age 6, a tree was hit by lightning on our property. And my father came home and told me 4 days later, and I heard it happen. I mean, it was like the loudest damn lightning strike you'd ever would hear, like a Frankenstein movie. This thing went off. It was like 4 in the afternoon. My father came home 4 days later from work and came home kind of blue. It was one of these great big old oak trees in the middle of the St. Louis Country Club grounds, like 300 years old. And he goes, God, I got some bad news. That tree got hit by lightning. It's dead. I got to pay a bunch of money to have it ripped down. I was 6 years old, maybe 7. I remember my instant reaction was the maudlin, morose, frightening that it died. I went out to this tree and hugged it and cried myself over this tree's death. So I don't know what it is. It's a great question. Somehow I think these things are put inside of us. I don't know how it occurs with everybody, but with me, it was innate. It was there. Who puts those questions there in our... God does, is my answer. I didn't do it. I didn't go through some course between age 0 and 6 to come up with go hugging a tree. I was inclined to be considerate for the tree, and yet other people don't in the same gene pool. So I don't know the answer, except care and compassion for the human condition is a good start. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be interested after your question to know of the people here who would be willing to. Those who have ancestors in their family who were slaveholders in the United States, let's see how many of us there are.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot.
Yeah, about 5 of us. Yeah. And how do you do? I'd like to ask. May I pick up that question? Our good friend Jedediah in the back, who's now playing Candy Crush on his iPhone. Jed, you've traversed through life. With a calling, you early on you felt a calling. How did you deal with when did you find out about the reality of slavery in your past? And may I ask further, did it impart on you a direction in your life? Well, I've learned from public speaking of many years is you never follow up with a man of the cloth who mentions the word Jesus. So thank you very much for tonight. It was fun.